Slave Trade in Latin America by Jacques Laparollery. Slave Trade in Latin America by Jacques Ryan Laparollery. Colonial Latin and Caribbean 1500 to 1825. History 2161. Latin 2161. Fall semester 2023. December 2nd, 2023. Professor Harry Francois Rivera. Why was the slave trade so lucrative? Slave labor allowed for large-scale productions of cash crops such as tobacco and sugar, which was in high demand at the time. The slave trade created a booming industry involving shipbuilding, ship provisions, insurance, and finance, which contributed to the overall economic growth. What, when, where, and who? European merchants and traders, particularly from countries such as Britain, Portugal, Spain, and France, were heavily involved in transatlantic slave trade. Slave auctioneers were responsible for the buying and selling of enslaved individuals at markets or auctions. Debate of the slave trade. To enable the accumulation of wealth for slave owners through the exploitation of enslaved labor, to facilitate the circulation of goods and profits across different continents through the triangular trade system, to maintain and reinforce existing power structures and socioeconomic inequalities, to enable the accumulation of wealth for enslaved owners through the exploitation of enslaved labor, to facilitate the circulation of goods and profits across different continents through the triangular trade system, to maintain and reinforce existing power structures and socioeconomic inequality. African slave trade. The African slave trade spanned over 4 centuries, from the 15th to the 19th century. The slave trade was primarily driven by European colonial powers seeking cheap labor for their colonies. Middle Passage. Slave ships known as floating coffins transported slaves in harsh and inhumane conditions. The journey across the Atlantic Ocean typically lasted from 6 to 8 weeks, but could be longer depending upon weather conditions. Many Africans died during the Middle Passage due to disease, malnutrition, and suicide. Slave labor. African slaves were brought to Latin America primarily to work on sugar and tobacco plantations. Brazil received the largest number of African slaves, followed by countries like Cuba, Colombia, and Peru. The African slaves primarily originated. It evolved and forced transportation of millions of Africans from the continent to various regions across the Americas and Europe. African kingdoms and tribes were involved in capturing and selling slaves, initially trading prisoners of war, but later engaging in raiding and kidnapping.